She had nothing, yet she carried herself like she owned the world. He had everything, yet he felt empty inside. When a homeless woman with an unbreakable spirit crosses paths with a ruthless billionaire, sparks fly, hearts collide, and a love story unfolds that neither of them saw coming. But can love truly heal a broken past? The city never sleeps. The streets buzz with life, neon lights flickering like fireflies in the dark. Cars rush past, their horns blending into the chaotic symphony of the night. Somewhere, far above in the towering skyline, people sip expensive wine, celebrating victories they hardly earned. But down here, on the cold, unforgiving pavement, reality is different. Sophia Carter sits on the edge of a wooden bench in Central Park, her worn-out hoodie pulled tight around her trembling body. The December wind cuts through her like a blade, but she refuses to show weakness. Her hands, tucked inside her sleeves, are stiff from the cold. Yet she doesn't beg. She doesn't plead. She just sits there, still, silent, watching. Her gaze is sharp, scanning the well-dressed couples strolling by, the businessmen checking their Rolex watches, the women wrapped in designer coats, laughing without a care in the world. It isn't jealousy in her eyes. Number. It's something stronger, a quiet defiance, because she may have lost everything, her home, her security, the life she once knew, but she refuses to lose her pride. Across the street, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulls up in front of a five-star restaurant. The valet rushes forward, bowing slightly as the door swings open. A man steps out, tall, confident, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably costs more than most people make in a year. Ethan Blackwood, billionaire, ruthless businessman. A man who built an empire with his bare hands, crushing competitors without hesitation. His chiseled jaw is set in its usual expression, stoic, unreadable. His deep, piercing eyes scan his surroundings out of habit, though nothing truly interests him anymore. Money, power, luxury. He has it all. Yet somehow there's an emptiness in his chest that no amount of wealth can fill. He's used to seeing people treat him with either fear or admiration. But that night, in the dim glow of streetlights, his gaze locks onto something, or rather someone, completely different. Her, the girl on the bench. She's different. Not because she's sitting alone, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. Not because the world has clearly been unkind to her, but because of her eyes. Most homeless people look away when someone like him walks past, either out of shame or silent begging. But she doesn't. She meets his gaze head-on, her expression unyielding, like she's daring him to judge her. For the first time in a long time, Ethan feels something unexpected. Curiosity. With a deep breath, he crosses the street, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He stops a few feet away from her, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. She doesn't move, doesn't flinch. He studies her for a moment before speaking. It's freezing out here. You should be somewhere warm. Her lips curl into the faintest hint of a smirk. You think I don't know that? Her voice is smooth but laced with quiet sarcasm. Ethan raises an eyebrow. Most people don't talk to him like that. He pulls out his wallet, retrieving a few crisp $100 bills, and extends them toward her. Here, get yourself something to eat. She glances at the money but makes no move to take it. Instead, she leans back slightly, crossing her arms. Let me guess, she says, tilting her head. You give out money to feel better about yourself? Classic rich guy move. A flicker of amusement crosses Ethan's face. He wasn't expecting that. Or maybe I just don't like seeing people suffer. And maybe I don't like being someone's charity case. There's no bitterness in her voice, just firm, unshakable dignity. For a moment, they just stare at each other. The tension is palpable, stretching between them like an invisible thread. Ethan, always in control, always knowing the right thing to say, finds himself at a rare loss for words. She isn't impressed by his wealth. She isn't afraid of his power, and for the first time in years, he feels intrigued. "What's your name?" he finally asks. "Sophia." No last name, no unnecessary details, just Sophia. The wind picks up and she shivers slightly, but she still doesn't take the money. Ethan watches her for a moment longer before tucking the bills back into his pocket. He respects it. Without another word, he turns to leave. But before he takes more than 3 steps, her voice stops him. "Hey, Moneybags." He glances over his shoulder, amused by the nickname. "What?" Sophia smirks again, but this time, there's something softer in her expression. "You're the first rich guy I've met who actually tried." And just like that, she turns away, pulling her hoodie tighter like she's just dismissed him. Ethan exhales sharply, shaking his head. Damn. She isn't like anyone he's ever met before. And that is dangerous. Because for the first time in his life, he wants to know more. The wind howls through the city, weaving between skyscrapers, carrying the scent of fresh rain and expensive cologne. Ethan Blackwood stands outside his car, staring at the spot where she sat just moments ago. Sophia. The girl who refused his money. The girl who looked him in the eye with defiance instead of desperation. The girl whose smirk lingers in his mind like a haunting melody. He exhales sharply, slipping into the back seat of his Rolls-Royce. "Home, sir?" the driver asks. Ethan hesitates. He should say yes. Should go back to his penthouse, pour himself a glass of bourbon, and move on with his night. But he doesn't. Instead, his gaze flickers back toward the empty bench. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirs in his chest. Something dangerously close to curiosity. He doesn't just want to forget her. He wants to understand her. Why does she refuse help? What made her this way? And more importantly, why does he care? 4 days later. Ethan tells himself it was a fleeting moment. An interesting encounter, nothing more. But then, on the 4th night, as rain pours from the heavens in heavy sheets, he spots her again. Same park, same bench. But this time, she's drenched. Her hoodie is soaked through, clinging to her frame, her hair matted against her skin. Yet still she sits, unmoved. A mix of frustration and admiration flares in Ethan's chest. Does she always choose to suffer? He doesn't think. He just moves. Moments later, he's standing in front of her, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. She looks up, eyes narrowing. "You again?" Ethan smirks. "Disappointed?" Mildly, but there's a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Take the coffee." She hesitates, then sighs, taking the cup with both hands. "If I take this, does it make me your charity case?" "Number it. Just makes you someone with good taste in coffee." A small, almost reluctant smile tugs at her lips. She takes a sip. Her eyes close briefly, savouring the warmth, and for a split second, Ethan wonders, what would it be like to be the reason she smiles like that? Damn, this is dangerous. Sophia opens her eyes, studying him. "Why are you here?" Ethan leans against the lamppost, crossing his arms. "I could ask you the same thing. This is my home. The streets? Not the worst place I've been." Her tone is casual, but something flickers behind her gaze, a shadow of a past she doesn't want to talk about. Ethan doesn't push. Instead, he offers something unexpected. "Stay with me for a month." Sophia nearly chokes on her coffee. "Excuse me?" "1 month." His voice is smooth, steady. "Not as a charity case, not as a pity project, on your own terms." She stares at him like he's lost his mind. "Why the hell would I do that?" Ethan shrugs. "You're obviously smart, independent. I think you deserve more than this bench. So let's make it interesting." "Interesting how?" A slow, dangerous smirk tugs at his lips. "A challenge." "A challenge?" she repeats skeptically. "You survive in my world for a month and I'll survive in yours for a day." Sophia's brows shoot up. "You? Survive in my world? In your $1,000 suits and luxury cars? I can handle it." "Oh, I would pay to see that." Ethan chuckles. "Then take the deal." For the first time, there's hesitation in her expression, a war between pride and curiosity. Ethan watches as she bites her lip, deep in thought. That simple action sends a rush of heat through his veins, but he forces himself to stay composed. Finally, she exhales. Fine. 1 month. But if you treat me like some rich guy's project, I walk. Ethan extends his hand. Deal. Sophia eyes him warily, then slowly places her palm against his. And the second their skin touches, it's electric. Neither of them moves. Neither of them breathes. Something unseen passes between them, something undeniable. And just like that, the game begins. The city stretched out beneath them, a glittering sea of light and motion. From the 52nd floor of the Blackwood Tower, everything looked small, distant. It was a view meant for kings, for men who built empires. And now, for the first time in her life, Sophia Carter stood here. She exhaled slowly, hands shoved into the pockets of the oversized hoodie Ethan had insisted she replace. She refused, of course. Impressive, huh? Ethan's voice was smooth, casual, as he leaned against the sleek black marble counter. Sophia didn't look at him. It's a lot of glass and gold. Nothing I haven't seen in a museum. His lips twitched. So, you're saying my penthouse looks like a museum? She turned to face him now, her dark eyes flickering with something unreadable. Number museums have history. This place feels... She searched for the word. Ethan waited. Empty. For the first time, her words hit him somewhere deep, somewhere he wasn't prepared for. Because she was right. Ethan had brought women here before, models, actresses, socialites who sipped champagne and admired the chandeliers. None of them had ever called it empty. Sophia was different. She didn't gawk at the $1 million artwork on the walls, didn't run her fingers over the leather furniture. She wasn't impressed at all. And yet, she belonged here more than any of them ever had. You're not going to give me a tour, are you? She teased, tilting her head. Ethan smirked. I figured you'd rather explore on your own. Good guess. She turned and walked further into the penthouse, her presence both out of place and completely at home. And Ethan couldn't stop watching her. By the time dinner rolled around, Sophia had already figured out 2 things. 1. Ethan Blackwood might be rich, but he was still just a man. 2. He was watching her. A lot. Not in the usual way men looked at women. No, his gaze was sharp, calculating, like he was trying to solve her. Well, good luck with that, moneybags. She took a bite of the perfectly cooked steak in front of her, chewing slowly. Across the long, polished dining table, Ethan watched. Something wrong? He asked, sipping his wine. Sophia raised an eyebrow. I'm waiting for the 5-star service. Ethan smirked. You mean the staff? Yeah, where are they? He set his glass down. I gave them the night off. That caught her off guard. Why? He shrugged. Thought you'd appreciate the privacy. She studied him, trying to decipher his angle, and for the first time she wondered, what exactly have I gotten myself into? No one ever gave without expecting something in return. At least, no one she'd ever met. But Ethan just sat there, completely at ease, like he wasn't the richest man in the room, like he wasn't the one with all the power. For the first time that night, Sophia felt unguarded, and that scared her more than anything. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't awkward. No, it was something else, something charged. Sophia could feel his gaze on her, even when she wasn't looking. Could hear the way he breathed just a little deeper every time she tucked her hair behind her ear. Ethan was used to control, but around her, it was slipping, and she liked that. After dinner, Sophia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed as she stared out at the city. You built all this? She murmured. Ethan stepped beside her. His reflection in the glass was sharp, unreadable. Not alone. Must be nice. It has its moments. Silence stretched between them, and then he did something unexpected. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Sophia froze. The touch was barely there, but it sent a spark through her veins, hot, unexpected, dangerous. Her breath hitched, but she refused to step back. Ethan didn't move either. They were too close now. The air between them was thick, electric. His eyes flickered to her lips for half a second, just long enough for her to notice, just long enough to make her wonder what would happen if she closed the distance. And for the first time since she met him, she realized she wasn't the only one playing with fire. The moment stretched between them, thick and unyielding. Sophia could feel the warmth of Ethan's breath, subtle, steady, his presence dangerously close. The city lights reflected in the glass, flickering like silent witnesses to whatever was happening between them. His fingers, still hovering near her face, had barely touched her skin. And yet, she felt it everywhere. The slow, deliberate way his eyes moved from hers, to her lips, to her throat, before dragging back up, like he was trying to memorize her. Sophia swallowed, pulse hammering, but she refused to step away. She wouldn't be the first to break. Ethan, however, he smirked. Not the cocky billionaire smirk she'd seen before. This was different. This was dangerous. "You should be careful, Sophia." His voice was low, smooth, threaded with something that sent a shiver down her spine. She tilted her head, pretending to be unaffected. Of what? Ethan's gaze never left hers. "Fire!" Sophia let out a breathy laugh. "I'm not afraid of getting burned." Ethan's smirk deepened. Good. And then, just like that, he took a step back. Cool air rushed between them, but the heat lingered. Sophia clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. She hated that he had that effect on her. Even more, she hated that he knew it. The next few days inside Ethan's world were nothing like Sophia expected. She thought he'd treat her like a project, like some charity case he needed to fix. He didn't. Instead, he challenged her, pushed her, teased her, and worst of all, he made her want to know him. Sophia watched the way his employees both respected and feared him, the way he commanded every room he walked into without even trying. But it was the quiet moments that confused her the most, like the way he rubbed his temple when he was stressed, his fingers pressing just above his brow. Or the way he always ordered an extra espresso shot but never finished the cup. Or the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one neither of them wanted to admit was already in motion. Sophia couldn't sleep. The city was too loud. The bed, too soft. She was used to pavement and distant sirens, not luxury linens, and a view of the skyline that felt unreal. Sighing, she padded barefoot toward the open balcony, the night air crisp against her skin. She didn't expect to find him there. Ethan stood by the railing, dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong, tensed forearms. In his hand, a glass of whiskey, half empty. He turned slightly at the sound of her footsteps, his gaze sweeping over her oversized hoodie and bare legs. Something flickered in his eyes. Something dark. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured. Sophia shook her head, stepping forward. "Me neither." They stood there in silence, the city stretching out below them. Sophia glanced at his glass. "Is that supposed to help?" Ethan smirked, swirling the amber liquid. "It's supposed to." "And?" He exhaled, looking straight ahead. "It doesn't." She watched him closely. There was something different about him tonight. Less controlled, less untouchable. Sophia leaned against the railing, her shoulder just inches from his. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" she asked, staring at the sea of lights. Ethan chuckled, but it lacked amusement. "And go where?" "Anywhere. Somewhere that doesn't feel—" She searched for the right word. "Empty." Ethan turned his head toward her, eyes locking onto hers. "Is that how you see me?" His voice was quiet. "Empty?" Sophia hesitated, and for the first time, she told him the truth. "No." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I see a man who has everything, except the one thing he actually wants. Ethan stilled. His grip on the glass tightened slightly, but he said nothing. The tension between them was thick, suffocating. What do you think I want? He asked, voice lower now. Sophia licked her lips. You tell me. And just like that, Ethan reached out, slowly, deliberately. His fingers brushed against her jaw, tilting her face up just slightly. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move away. She should have, but she didn't. Instead, she let herself get lost in his gaze. Dark, intense, searching. Ethan exhaled, his thumb tracing the corner of her lip so lightly she thought she imagined it. You make it very hard to stay in control, Sophia. Her heart pounded. Then don't. And just like that, he kissed her. The kiss was slow, deliberate. A question and an answer, all in one. Ethan's lips brushed against hers, testing, searching, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, Sophia leaned in, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself in the moment. And just like that, control shattered. Ethan exhaled sharply, deepening the kiss, his hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her closer. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through her veins, hot, consuming, dangerous. Sophia felt like she was falling into something she couldn't name. And maybe she didn't want to name it. For once, she just wanted to feel. The city hummed below them, indifferent to the two souls caught in a moment that neither had planned. His lips moved against hers, slow at first, then hungrier, like he had been waiting for this longer than he cared to admit. And Sophia let herself want him. The moment lasted too long. And yet, not long enough. Because when Ethan finally pulled back, just slightly, their breaths still mingling in the cold night air, Sophia felt it. The weight of what just happened, the electricity still buzzing between them. His forehead rested lightly against hers, his hand still pressed against her spine. Sophia. His voice was rough, like he was struggling to find the right words. She closed her eyes for a brief second, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. What the hell am I doing? Sophia never let herself get close, never let herself want. Because wanting meant expecting. And expectations? They led to disappointment. She took a slow, shaky breath before whispering, This can't happen. Ethan stilled. She felt it, the way his entire body tensed against hers, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled. A slow, knowing, frustratingly smug smile. It already did. Sophia's stomach flipped. Damn him. Damn him for making this so difficult. She took a small step back, crossing her arms over her chest, forcing a smirk. I think the whiskey's messing with your judgment, moneybags. Ethan chuckled, low and deep. Whiskey has nothing to do with it. She hated the way his voice affected her, hated the way he was so sure of himself. Because she was terrified. Sophia needed space. She turned swiftly, muttering a good night before disappearing into the penthouse. She could feel Ethan watching her go, could almost hear his thoughts. But she didn't stop. She didn't breathe until she reached her room, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched her lips. She could still feel him, still taste him. Damn it. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to stay detached, unaffected, unreachable. Because Ethan Blackwood, he wasn't a risk she could afford. Not when she knew how men like him worked. Not when she had already lost too much. She took a slow breath, pressing her forehead against the cold door. This was nothing. Just a mistake. One she wouldn't repeat. Right? Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, tie loosened, fingers pressed against his temple. What the hell was happening to him? Sophia Carter, a woman with nothing. And yet, somehow, she had him. Had him thinking about her when he should be thinking about a million other things. Had him craving something money couldn't buy. had him feeling like he wasn't in control for the first time in years. Ethan didn't lose. He didn't chase. He didn't want. And yet, here he was, wanting her. When Sophia walked into the kitchen the next morning, she looked calm, collected, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't kissed the most powerful man in the city just hours ago. Ethan sat at the breakfast counter sipping his espresso, watching her with that same unreadable expression. She refused to meet his eyes. Good, maybe he'd drop it. Maybe last night was just a moment, a slip. Maybe she could pretend nothing had changed. But then, he smirked, that damn smirk. "Sleep well?" he asked, voice smooth as silk. Sophia froze. Her fingers clenched around the coffee mug she had just grabbed, but she forced her face into a mask of indifference. Like a baby. Ethan's smirk deepened. Liar. The kitchen was too quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't comfortable, the kind that was filled with unspoken things. Sophia sat at the breakfast counter, slowly stirring her coffee, not because it needed stirring, but because it gave her something to do. Ethan sat across from her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face, his espresso cup untouched. He was waiting for her to say something, waiting for her to acknowledge what had happened last night. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow sip of her coffee, pretending not to notice the way he was watching her. But Ethan wasn't a man who was used to being ignored, especially not by her. "So," his voice was slow, smooth, dangerous. "Are we going to talk about it?" Sophia didn't even flinch. "Talk about what?" Ethan's lips curled into a knowing smirk. Damn him. She hated that smirk. She hated that he looked so calm, so in control when she was anything but. "The kiss, Sophia." His voice was lower now, deliberate. "You can't pretend it didn't happen." Her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug, but she forced herself to stay composed. She met his gaze, arching an eyebrow. It was a moment. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her. "A moment?" "Yes." She set her cup down, crossing her arms. "Nothing more." He leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "Liar." Sophia's jaw clenched. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're good at hiding, don't you?" She didn't answer. Because the truth? She had spent her whole life hiding, and Ethan Blackwood was too damn close to seeing through her. The rest of the day, Ethan didn't mention the kiss again, but he didn't forget it either. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way his presence lingered too close when he walked past her, in the way his fingers brushed against hers when he handed her a file, in the way his voice dropped just slightly when he said her name. And the worst part? She was hyper-aware of him too, of the way his shirt fit a little too well, sleeves rolled up, exposing strong forearms, of the way he loosened his tie after long meetings, sighing in that way that made something tighten in her stomach, of the way his jaw clenched every time another man looked at her. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was dangerous. That night, Sophia decided she needed distance. Maybe a walk. Maybe some fresh air. Maybe just space from him. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby, but before the doors could close, Ethan stepped in. Of course, he leaned against the back wall, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Going somewhere," Sophia exhaled slowly. "Just getting some air." Ethan nodded. "Mind if I join?" She gave him a flat look. "Yes, actually." He smirked, ignoring her answer completely. Damn him. The elevator doors slid shut and the space suddenly felt too small. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, dark, rich, intoxicating. She hated how easily she noticed it. The floor number ticked down. She kept her eyes ahead. But then, without warning, the elevator jolted, stopped. Lights flickered. Silence. Then, Ethan sighed. "You've got to be kidding me." Sophia's heart jumped into her throat. She reached out, pressing the emergency button. "Nothing." "Tell me this isn't happening." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Looks like we're stuck." Sophia groaned, pressing her forehead against the cold metal wall. Great, just great. She felt Ethan move behind her, his presence way too close. Nervous, he murmured. She turned her head, glaring. No. Ethan smirked. Liar. Before she could snap at him, the air shifted. Thick. Electric. Sophia felt it. The pull. And judging by the way Ethan's gaze darkened, he felt it too. The confined space. The tension that had been simmering between them for days. She swallowed hard. This was not the time, not the place, and yet... Ethan took a slow step forward. Not enough to touch her, but enough to make her breath hitch, enough to make her heart race. Sophia? His voice was lower now, softer. She felt his warmth even though he hadn't touched her. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She should move, should break whatever this was, but she didn't. She just stood there, frozen. And then, his fingers brushed against her wrist. A simple touch, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through her body. She sucked in a sharp breath, her lips parting slightly. And Ethan? He noticed. His gaze flickered to her lips just for a second, and in that moment, Sophia knew. If she didn't stop this now, she wouldn't stop it at all. She forced a step back, breaking the invisible thread between them. Ethan's jaw tensed. Running again? She met his gaze. No. And then, the elevator whirred back to life. The doors slid open. Sophia stepped out without looking back. But the way Ethan's eyes followed her, she felt that more than any touch. Sophia stormed out of the elevator, her pulse still thundering in her ears. What the hell was that? She could still feel him, his touch, barely there, yet it had left a mark she couldn't erase. The intensity in his eyes, the way the air between them had thickened to the point where even breathing had felt like a risk. And worst of all, she had wanted him to close that distance, wanted to know what would have happened if she hadn't stepped away. Damn him. Damn Ethan Blackwood for making her feel this way. She needed air. She needed space. And most of all, she needed to remind herself that men like him were dangerous. Ethan stepped out of the elevator a moment later. Unlike Sophia, he didn't rush, didn't run. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, watching her from across the penthouse, waiting. Sophia hated that he could look so calm, so collected, like that moment between them hadn't shaken him the way it had shaken her. She crossed her arms, standing near the window, her back to him. She heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, as he walked toward her. Too close. Always too close. You're running. His voice was smooth, but there was something dangerous beneath it. Sophia let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. You really think everything is a game, don't you? Ethan tilted his head, studying her. And you really think you're fooling me? Her jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. He stepped even closer. Yes, you do. She could feel his presence now, heat radiating off his body. His cologne, dark, rich, intoxicating, wrapped around her, making it impossible to think. She should move. She should end this. But her body betrayed her. She stayed rooted in place, gripping the edge of the window frame like it was the only thing keeping her from losing herself. Ethan's voice dropped, low, dangerous. Tell me, Sophia. What are you so afraid of? She turned her head just slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. And what she saw there, it undid her. Dark, smouldering, like he already knew the answer, like he could already see the war inside her. Her throat tightened. I'm not afraid of anything, Ethan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. His fingers brushed against the exposed skin of her arm. Barely there, but it burned. Liar! Sophia's breath hitched. Her skin was on fire where he touched her, but she wouldn't give in. She refused. With all the strength she had left, she forced herself to turn fully, putting space between them. Ethan didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply watched her, the same way a hunter watches his prey, patient, knowing, and she hated that he made her feel like prey. Sophia exhaled sharply. Look, Ethan, whatever this is, it's real. His words stopped her cold. Sophia's heart slammed against her ribs. No, no, no. He didn't get to say that. She shook her head. This is nothing. Ethan's lips twitched, amusement flickering in his eyes. He wasn't buying it. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them again. Then why are you shaking? Her breath caught. She hadn't realized she was. Damn him. Damn him for seeing through her, for knowing her tells, for knowing exactly how to unravel her, Sophia snapped. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the fact that he refused to let this go. Or maybe it was because she wanted him, more than she had ever wanted anything, more than she was ready to admit. With a frustrated growl, she pushed against his chest. Hard. Ethan barely stumbled back. His expression flickered with surprise, but then that damn smirk returned. That all you got? He taunted. Sophia clenched her fists. You're impossible. Ethan tilted his head. And yet, you're still here. She groaned, spinning on her heel, but before she could take a step, he grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but firm, unyielding. Sophia turned, ready to push him away again, ready to tell him off. But the second their eyes met, she knew she was in too deep, because Ethan's gaze wasn't teasing anymore. It was raw, real, filled with something she wasn't ready to name. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. His grip on her wrist tightened just slightly, and then he pulled her to him. Not roughly, not forcefully, just with certainty. With the kind of certainty that broke her resolve completely. And before she could stop herself, she kissed him first. This wasn't like the last time. This wasn't slow, this wasn't careful, this was fire. A collision. A storm finally breaking free. Sophia didn't hold back this time, didn't overthink, didn't fight it. She let herself want. And Ethan? Ethan devoured her. His hands curved around her waist, pulling her flush against him. A low groan rumbled in his throat as she fisted his shirt, as if she couldn't get close enough. His lips were rough, urgent, yet somehow they made her feel safe. And that terrified her more than anything. Because safe? Safe was a lie. The kiss slowed, softened, until Ethan finally pulled back, just slightly. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the small space between them. Sophia's fingers were still curled into his shirt. Ethan's hands were still on her waist. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Because words would ruin this. Words would make it real. And real was dangerous. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that comes with peace, the kind of silence that feels like a storm waiting to break. Sophia was still close enough to feel Ethan's breath on her lips, still close enough to smell his cologne, rich, intoxicating, dangerous. Her fingers were still curled into his shirt, his hands still firm on her waist, and neither of them moved, because moving meant facing reality. And reality? Reality was messy. Reality was the fact that she had just kissed him, that she had been the one to close the distance, that she had been the one who let herself want. And now? Now she had to face the consequences. Sophia was the first to move. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She forced herself to take a step back, ignoring the way her body immediately protested. Ethan's grip loosened, but his eyes stayed locked onto her. Dark, intense, searching. Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, taking a shaky breath. This was a mistake. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. Is that what you really think? She nodded, even though her chest felt tight, even though her heart was screaming otherwise. Yes. Her voice came out softer than she wanted. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Sophia, you can lie to yourself all you want, but don't lie to me. She looked away. She had to, because the way he was looking at her, like he saw through every defense she had, like he knew she wanted to run, like he was the only person who had ever truly understood her. And that That was terrifying. For the next few days, Sophia avoided him. She told herself it was for the best, that whatever had happened between them was just a moment, that it didn't mean anything. But the problem with trying to ignore Ethan Blackwood, he doesn't let you, because every time she walked into a room, he was already there. Watching, waiting. Like he was giving her a chance to come to him, like he was daring her to admit the truth. And that only made her fight harder. But there was something else, something she didn't expect. Ethan had always been composed, controlled, untouchable. But now he was different. He was closer. Not physically, emotionally, in the small things. The way he lingered near her, the way his fingers brushed against hers just slightly when he handed her something, the way his gaze softened when she wasn't looking. And Sophia, she felt every damn bit of it. No matter how hard she tried to pretend, she didn't. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. A charity gala. One of the biggest of the year. Sophia wasn't surprised Ethan was attending. What surprised her some was that he wanted her to come with him. She stared at the elegant black envelope, her stomach twisting. "You want me to go to this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan leaned against the counter, smirking. "Scared?" She rolled her eyes. "Of a bunch of rich people sipping overpriced champagne? Please." Ethan chuckled, but his gaze stayed sharp. "Then say yes." Sophia hesitated. She wanted to say no, wanted to keep the distance, but some reckless, rebellious part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to see what it would be like to step into his world, on her own terms, wanted to see what would happen if she stopped running. And that was how she found herself standing in front of a mirror, wearing a dress she never thought she'd own. The fabric was sleek, hugging her in all the right places. She almost didn't recognize herself. But when she saw the way Ethan looked at her when she stepped into the room, the way his breath caught just slightly, she realized something. She had been afraid of stepping into his world. But maybe. He was afraid of how much he wanted her in it. The gala was overwhelming. Sophia didn't belong here. She could feel the eyes on her, the whispers, the people wondering who she was and why Ethan Blackwood had brought her. But Ethan didn't care. He stayed by her side, his hand lingering at the small of her back. A silent message. "You're with me." And for the first time, she let herself believe it. Then the music started, and Ethan held out his hand. "Dance with me." Sophia hesitated. "I don't dance," Ethan smirked. "Then let me teach you." She wanted to say no, wanted to fight it, but she didn't. She let him take her hand, and when he pulled her onto the dance floor, pressing her close, moving slow, effortless, like they had done this 1,000 times before, she knew. This was different. This wasn't just attraction. This wasn't just a moment. This was something she couldn't walk away from. And when she looked up, locking eyes with him, when she felt his fingers tighten slightly around her waist, his breath against her ear as he murmured, "Tell me to stop." She couldn't, because she didn't want him to. Not anymore. The music swirled around them, slow and intoxicating. Ethan held her close, his grip firm, yet gentle, like he was afraid to push too hard but even more afraid to let go. Sophia tried to focus on the dance, on the rhythm, on the whispers floating around them. But she couldn't, because all she could feel was him. The warmth of his palm against the small of her back, the way his fingers curled slightly when he pulled her in. The way his breath grazed her skin, sending shivers down her spine. She wasn't supposed to feel this, not this deep, not this fast. But God, she did. And it terrified her. Sophia swallowed hard, her heart beat too loud, too fast. She needed to get away. She needed to say something that would break this tension, this pull. "I know what this is." Her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the moment. Ethan's hold didn't loosen. "Oh?" he murmured, his voice dangerously low. "Then tell me." She took a breath, forcing herself to stay steady. This is a game to you. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something dark, something undeniable. He exhaled slowly, his hand sliding just slightly up her spine. Not enough to cross a line, but enough to make her feel claimed. You think I do this with just anyone? Her chest tightened. Yes. That's what she wanted to believe. That's what she needed to believe. Because the alternative, the possibility that this was real, that scared her more than anything. You're Ethan Blackwood. She tried to keep her voice steady. You can have anyone you want. His lips twitched. I know. He spun her slowly, the movement smooth, effortless. And then, when he pulled her back in, his hand slid just a little lower, his thumb brushing the curve of her waist. Her breath hitched. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His lips tilted into a slow, knowing smirk. And yet, here I am, still wanting you. Sophia's pulse slammed against her ribs. She opened her mouth, to argue, to fight back, but nothing came out. Because the truth, she wanted him too, and he knew it. Ethan leaned in, his voice just a whisper against her skin. Tell me to stop. Her hands trembled against his chest. She should, she needed to. But she didn't, because deep down, she knew. If she told him to stop, he would, but she didn't want him to. Not anymore. And that realization, it shattered everything. The dance ended, but the fire between them didn't. They didn't speak as he led her through the crowd, past the curious stares, past the whispers. They didn't speak when they stepped into his car, the space between them thick, heavy, electric. They didn't speak as the driver pulled away from the grand hall, leaving the city lights behind. And yet, so much was being said in the silence. Ethan didn't take his eyes off her. Sophia didn't look at him, because if she did, if she let herself see what was in his eyes, she'd fall. Completely. Hopelessly. And she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. The moment they stepped into the penthouse, the tension finally snapped. Ethan grabbed her wrist. Not rough, not demanding, just enough. Enough to make her stop. Enough to make her look at him. Her breath caught in her throat, because the way he was looking at her, like she was the only thing that had ever made sense in his life. Ethan. Her voice came out softer than she wanted. He took a step closer. Say it, Sophia. Her brows furrowed. Say what? He exhaled sharply, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her in so slowly, so deliberately that she had time to stop him. But she didn't. Say you don't feel this. His voice was low, raw. His forehead rested against hers, his grip tightening slightly. Say you don't want this. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come, because they'd be a lie. And they both knew it. Ethan tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing against her jaw. His eyes searched hers, dark, dangerous, and so full of something she wasn't ready to name. One last chance. His voice was barely above a whisper. Tell me to stop. Sophia swallowed hard. Everything in her screamed to run, to end this, to keep her heart safe. But for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be safe. She wanted him. So instead of pushing him away, she whispered the only truth that mattered. I can't. And the second the words left her lips, Ethan kissed her. The moment Sophia whispered those two words, I can't. Everything changed. Ethan didn't hesitate, didn't hold back. The second the words left her lips, he pulled her in, fast, desperate, claiming, and then his lips crashed against hers. This kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was fire. A storm that had been building for too long, now finally unleashed. His hands gripped her waist, fingers pressing into her skin, pulling her closer as if he was afraid she'd change her mind. Sophia's hands moved instinctively, gripping the front of his shirt, holding on like he was the only thing keeping her standing. And maybe he was. Because her knees, they felt weak. Her body, on fire. and Ethan. Ethan kissed her like he had been starving for this, like he had been waiting, like he owned every shaky breath she took. And in that moment, she let him. Ethan broke the kiss first, but only for a second, just long enough to rest his forehead against hers, breathing hard, trying to steady himself, but he couldn't, because control had already shattered. Sophia's lips were swollen, parted, her breath uneven. Ethan's hands tightened at her waist, his thumb brushing against her skin. A slow, deliberate tease. His voice was rough, low, wrecked. "Tell me this isn't a mistake." Sophia's eyes fluttered open, meeting his. Dark, intense, desperate. She didn't answer right away, because this was dangerous, because this was something she could lose herself in. But the way he was looking at her, like she was the only thing that mattered, like he was waiting for her, like he was giving her a choice, and maybe for the first time in her life. She didn't want to run. She reached up, fingers trailing along his jaw, her voice soft. If it was a mistake, her lips brushed against his. "I wouldn't be here." And just like that, Ethan lost the last of his restraint. He lifted her, effortless, powerful as if she weighed nothing. Sophia gasped, arms instinctively wrapping around his neck, but he didn't stop, didn't let her overthink, didn't give her a chance to pull away. He carried her across the dimly lit penthouse, his lips never leaving hers, deepening the kiss until she felt dizzy. Somehow they made it to his bedroom, but Sophia barely noticed, because all she could feel was him. The way his body pressed against hers. The way his hands explored firm but reverent, as if memorizing her, the way he worshipped her with every touch. It wasn't just lust. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something neither of them could escape anymore. And for the first time, Sophia let herself fall. No walls, no hesitation, no more running. Just Ethan. Just this. The sunlight streamed through the windows, golden and warm. Sophia stirred, the sheets soft against her bare skin. For a moment she kept her eyes closed, letting herself linger in the warmth, in the feeling of safety she hadn't felt in years. And then she felt him, the weight of his arm draped over her waist, pulling her against him. The slow, steady rhythm of his breath at her back. The way his hand instinctively tightened around her the second she shifted, as if refusing to let go. Her heart ached, because last night it had been real, too real. She swallowed, eyes opening as she turned her head just slightly. Ethan was still asleep, his face relaxed, completely unguarded. The powerful, ruthless billionaire, at peace. And all she could think was, what happens now? Because she had broken her own rules? Because she had let him in? And because deep down, she knew the truth. She was already falling for him. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Sophia lay still, wrapped in the warmth of Ethan's embrace. The morning light filtered through the curtains, painting golden patterns across the room. She could feel his steady breath against her shoulder, the weight of his arm over her waist, the way his fingers, even in sleep, curled protectively around her hip like he was afraid she'd disappear. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. But that was exactly what scared her the most, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was never supposed to get attached, to let herself want this, want him. And yet, here she was, lying in his bed, wrapped in his arms, and realizing with a sinking heart that she was falling in love with him. Completely, hopelessly, and maybe she already had. Sophia turned slowly, careful not to wake him. Her eyes traced his features, the sharp lines of his jaw, the soft shadow of his stubble, the way his lips parted slightly in sleep. He looked different like this, less guarded, less untouchable. Just a man, just her man. For a moment she let herself believe it, let herself imagine a world where she stayed, where she let herself be loved, where she let herself believe she was enough. But the fear? It was louder. She swallowed hard, heart pounding as she carefully slipped out of bed. Ethan stirred slightly, his fingers twitching as if reaching for her, but he didn't wake. Good. Because if he did, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. She got dressed in silence, her movements slow, hesitant. Every step toward the door felt heavier, like she was walking away from something she'd never find again. And maybe she was. Her fingers curled around the doorknob. She took one last look at him, the man who had changed everything. And then she walked away. Ethan woke to an empty bed. And he knew. The warmth of her was still there, but she wasn't. A muscle in his jaw tightened as he sat up, running a hand through his hair. He should have expected this. Should have known she'd run, because that's what she did. But damn it. He wasn't going to let her go. Not this time. Not when he knew what they had was real. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and called his driver. Find her. Sophia walked through the city streets, the cold biting at her skin. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to go, needed to breathe. But no matter how far she walked, the ache in her chest only grew heavier. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She wasn't meant for a life like his, wasn't meant to belong to a man like Ethan Blackwood. She was a girl who had nothing, and he was a man who had everything. She shook her head, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She had done the right thing. She had. But if that was true, why did it feel like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life? She barely noticed the sleek black car that pulled up beside her, not until the door swung open, not until he stepped out. Ethan. His eyes locked onto hers, furious, determined, unshaken. Sophia's breath caught. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice low, steady. "Bringing you home." Her heart clenched. "Ethan, No." His voice was sharp. "You don't get to run this time." She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling. "I don't belong in your world." Ethan let out a slow, controlled breath, and then he closed the distance between them. "Damn it, Sophia, don't you get it?" His hands framed her face, his touch firm, warm. "You are my world." Her lips parted, her walls cracked. "I don't care where you came from." His voice softened, but the intensity in his eyes remained. "I don't care what you've lost. I don't care what you think you deserve." He pressed his forehead against hers, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you, Sophia." Tears burned behind her eyes. No one had ever said those words to her. Not like this. Not like they meant it. "Ethan." Her voice was broken, shaky. He exhaled, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to be anything other than mine." Sophia let out a shaky breath. "And if I'm broken," Ethan smiled, "then we'll be broken together." Her heart shattered, because that was it. That was what she had been waiting for. Someone who wouldn't leave, someone who wouldn't try to fix her but love her anyway. And maybe she had just found him. With a soft, choked laugh, she whispered, "You really are impossible," Ethan smirked. "And yet, you're still here." She let out a breath, a real, shaky, hopeful breath, and then she kissed him. Not in desperation, not in fear, but in certainty, in love. And as his arms wrapped around her, holding her close, Sophia finally knew. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again.